Dr. Timothy Clark. He is a social scientist and an organizational consultant. Not only does he have extensive leadership experience, he holds impressive educational credentials and has authored multiple books to include the one we are exploring today, which goes without saying that as we build our high country community for coaches to thrive, Dr. Clark's presentation dovetails neatly into our ongoing challenge for creating a community for coaches to feel included, feel safe to learn, feel safe to contribute, and feel safe to challenge the status quo. Please welcome Dr. Clark to our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me? Is my audio coming through okay?
We can. Everybody can hear? Okay.
And can you see the slides? Just want to double check as we get started.
Everybody can see the slides? Yes.
Okay, terrific. Well, first of all, thank you to Vicki and Stacy very much for the invitation to join you in the High Country chapter of ICF. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be with you. And I want to recognize my colleague, Paul Terry. Paul and I go back 20 years, and we have worked and collaborated together for a long time. And I have enormous respect for Paul as a friend and a professional. He's one of the best of the very best. So today, I'm excited to talk to you about the concept of psychological safety, some of the concepts in the new book that we released in March. And I hope that you will find this to be very timely and relevant in your coaching practices, whether you're coaching one-on-one or you're doing team coaching. And I'd like to invite you to ask questions and make comments as we go through. Let's have a more of an interactive experience rather than a didactic experience, because that's not nearly as fun. And I want to make this as valuable as we possibly can for you as we have a little bit of time together. Okay, so let me begin with the agenda. So we're going to talk about psychological safety as the foundation of team performance, but we're going to focus on the coaching engagement and the dynamics of a coaching engagement. And then in the second module, we'll talk about the 4 stages framework. So let me begin with a diagnostic tool that we use. And the first, to frame it or to begin, I want to ask you to crack yourselves open today as coaches, as professionals, as you're working with both individuals and in a team setting. And here's the diagnostic tool. This is what we call the coachability assessment. So I want you to think about coachability as a function of 2 dimensions. Number 1, willingness, which you see on the vertical axis. And number 2, self-awareness, which you see on the horizontal axis. Think about the fusion of these 2 dimensions. And so if we create a 2x2 matrix based on this combination, we get 4 quadrants, obviously, and we can label them. Now, hopefully, we are coaching someone that is in the accelerating quadrant, upper right. High willingness, high self-awareness. That's the best of all of the combinations. And when we are coaching someone in that quadrant, they progress rapidly because they understand, they comprehend their position. They have bearing points. And so high self-awareness allows them to understand accurately where they are. They have an accurate mirror, a clean mirror. And then added to that, they have willingness. And so we can move quickly. Problem is, this isn't always the case, is it? Oftentimes, we are coaching people or teams that are not in that upper right quadrant. They may be in the lower left quadrant where they are failing or plateauing because their willingness is low and their self-awareness is low. Or bottom right, they're limping because their self-awareness is high, but their willingness is low. Or they're in the upper left, willingness is high, self-awareness is low. So I just want you to think about these 4 different combinations and then recognize that much of your stewardship as a coach is to help the coachee move up and to the right. You're trying to help them get into that upper right quadrant, that accelerating quadrant. How do you do that? Well, much of it is the relationship that you build, that you foster, that you cultivate. And much of that is a result of the conditions that you create. So we're going to talk about conditions in as we talk about psychological safety. Now I'm going to open the aperture. I'm going to zoom back out. And let's talk about why psychological safety is exploding as a concept. We see two forces at work in organizations. Number one is the moral force. The moral force is driving inclusion, and it's a response to social injustice. And we can see that. It's everywhere around us. The second force is the competitive force, which drives innovation. And in today's environment, it's a response to market turbulence. The more market turbulence you have, the shorter the span of competitive advantage, which means what? It means that you have to innovate more and you have to innovate faster. And so what we're seeing in organizations and with leaders is that they are responding to these two forces. Some may be more in response to one force or the other, but these two forces are on their radar screen. The moral force driving inclusion and the competitive force driving innovation. So why do we care about this? Why do people care so much, and why the explosion of demand for an understanding of psychological safety and then trying to figure out how to apply it? Well, I think we have a couple of shared goals. One is we're trying to create a sanctuary of inclusion in our relationships, on our teams, in our organizations. That's number one. Number two, we're trying to create an incubator of innovation, because innovation is the lifeblood of growth for almost every organization. So let me just stop there and ask you, so are you seeing evidence? Are these shared goals that you see with the clients that you work with within the organizations in which you work? What do you think? So go ahead and unmute yourselves, and if you have a comment or a question, go ahead. Does this resonate with you?
I would say in the organization I'm in, yes, the inclusion is a big, big piece, especially now.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think that, what I see out of this is it moves back and forth. If you create the sanctuary of inclusion, you're going to drive a faster innovation, because the team dynamics are going to be more solid. And as you drive that, the innovation piece, and create the sanctuary there, you are then driving back to the inclusion. And it's a self-fulfilling circle if you've got both, if you can drive that inclusion.
That's a great insight, Heather. And that was the last point or the last question that I wanted to ask you was, do you see the relationship between the two? Do you see that that having psychological safety and a sanctuary of inclusion becomes an enabling condition for innovation? They're mutually reinforcing. It's very interesting to see that relationship. Okay, so let's jump into psychological safety as a concept. The essence of the concept means that in a social setting, it's not expensive to be yourself. That's what psychological safety means. You will not encounter negative or adverse consequences interpersonally as you're interacting with other people. When it is expensive, what categories of expense are we talking about? How can it be expensive? Do you have any comments on that? Any observations?
Conflict and stress.
Okay. That's a really good point. Stress is expensive. What other kinds of expense are we talking about?
Loss of trust.
Okay. Excellent.
What about
Also loss of-
vulnerability?
Say that again.
Sorry, what about vulnerability?
Yeah, vulnerability across the board, right? We're going to talk about that. That's a great point. What else?
Also your own self-confidence.
Yes, confidence, self-confidence. Excellent. So I just want you to just think about this for a minute. Expense, when it's interpersonally expensive to be yourself, we're talking about emotional expense, social expense, economic expense, political expense. There are many categories of expense that we're talking about. If it's expensive, what do human beings do? They change their behavior. They change their behavior, and the consequences, the unintended consequences, are not good. So let's talk about this process and think about it from a coaching standpoint. When people interact, when someone comes into a new social environment, they immediately begin the process of what we call threat detection. They are looking around, observing, perceiving. What are they trying to figure out? And this is not they, this is all of us. We all do this subconsciously. We're trying to figure out if we're in a safe or an unsafe setting, environment, right? Is it safe or is it not unsafe? We're doing a risk reward calculation in our heads, not consciously, but we do this all the time. And even when we work with the same people over and over again, we still do this. It's ongoing. It's never done. It's never permanently done. So this is a dynamic process. If it's safe, we tend to offer an offensive response. If it's unsafe, we tend to offer a defensive response. What's the difference? The difference is if I'm offering a defensive response, that means I have to manage personal risk. I have to go into a mode of self-preservation and loss avoidance. So what happens to my productivity? It goes down. Why does it go down? Now, it may go down a little, it may go down a lot, but it's going to go down because I'm taking a portion of my productive output, my creative output, and I'm spending it on self-protection. And so I can't lean into things offensively. That's the difference. So when we do threat detection, we're looking around, but what specifically are we looking for? We're looking, I'll tell you what we look for, because this is what we've done in our research. We're looking to see if we can find people engaging in acts of vulnerability. That's the first thing that we're looking for, acts of vulnerability. Number two, we are observing the response patterns to those acts of vulnerability. That's what we care about. Acts of vulnerability, number one, responses to acts of vulnerability, number two. So here's what happens. We're trying to figure out if those acts of vulnerability are being rewarded or punished. If they are punished, there are very real consequences. For example, identity, social interaction, and performance become expensive. And when they become expensive, as I said, we change our behavior. So let's talk about when things get expensive, when there's a breach in psychological safety, when an act of vulnerability gets punished instead of rewarded. Here's some examples. Would someone like to read through these for us? I want you to reflect on these as we're reading through these. Could we have a volunteer?
I'm happy to, Tim, if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Have you, excuse me, have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you ever been afraid to ask a question? Have you ever remained silent when you knew the answer to a problem? Have you ever had someone steal credit for something you did? Have you ever been ignored in a discussion? Have you ever been rudely interrupted in a meeting? Have you ever felt that you were the target of a negative stereotype? Have you ever faced retaliation for challenging the status quo? Have you ever had a boss who asked for feedback but didn't really want it? Have you ever been publicly shamed or made fun of? Have you ever been punished for making an honest mistake? Have you ever been made to feel inferior?
Thanks, Paul. So let me ask you this question. I want you to think about this. When was the last time one of these happened to you? And the reason that I ask that question is you need to reflect on how rare or common these patterns are. So what do you think? Any observations or comments on this? How rare or common do you think these patterns are? What do you think?
I think they're common.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my thought. I think they're very common, and especially for people that are kind of underserved. I think it's even more common for them.
Yeah.
And Tim, we had a comment in the chat that it's common.
Okay. So you are all 100% right. Let me tell you how common. So we've done some survey research. 60% of those surveyed, and this is a projectable sample, 60% say that at least one of these has happened in the last 24 hours. That's how common. Now, I wish that that were not the case, but unfortunately, these are everyday breaches of psychological safety. So now the next question is, well, is it that big of a deal? Okay, so they're common, but yeah, we tend to make mistakes as humans in the way that we interact with each other. But who cares? Well, here's what happens, and this is where the study of psychological safety is really, the research is catching up with our intuition. Here's what happens. At least three things happen when there's a breach. Number one, an event like this triggers the pain centers of the brain. Number two, it activates our self-censoring instinct. So we begin to change our behavior. We begin to self-censor. And number three, it shifts us into a defensive mode of performance instead of offense. So if I were to graphically portray this, this is what it looks like. So we look at the environment that ranges from high fear at one end to high psychological safety at the other. At the fear end, we're playing defense. At the psychological safety end, we're playing offense. Every human being in every social setting every day is somewhere on this spectrum. But what we're starting to understand better than we ever have is that if you're playing defense, then you're not able to contribute, you're not able to create value, you're not able to engage the way that you could. You're not reaching your potential. So the unintended consequences are quite profound. So let me ask you a question. What are some acts of vulnerability that you engage in or that others that you work with engage in every day? Not complicated things, but very common everyday acts of vulnerability. What would they be? What do you think?
I think admitting when you don't know an answer, being able to say, I really don't know.
Yeah, fantastic. Yep. What else?
And in the chat, we had acknowledging mistakes.
Yeah, acknowledging mistakes.
Asking questions you think are stupid.
That's right. It's so true, isn't it? So we have acknowledging mistakes, saying I don't know, just asking questions. is an act of vulnerability.
Sometimes
Often.
it's, I was going to say, sometimes it's just participating too. I mean, sometimes people won't even say anything, send a question, but just to make a comment or contribute a point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. Just making a comment.
Some other answers we had in chat was sharing a difficult challenge, trying something new, sharing opinion, and sharing a time you failed.
Okay, fantastic. Fantastic. Here's another one. Asking for help. Just asking for help. These are common everyday acts of vulnerability. And whether it's really registered with you or not, when you're doing threat detection, you're looking at these things. You're observing your colleagues and you're watching what happens when they engage in one of these acts of vulnerability. Was that rewarded? Was that punished? And then we take notes. And we're very good at doing this. Now let's talk a little bit more about the costs. So here are some results from a longitudinal study conducted at Harvard. And the respondents in this study, it's pretty incredible what they said. So take a look at the first finding. And basically what the question was, what do you do when there's been a breach of psychological safety, right? And it's triggered the pain centers of the brain. It's activated the self-censoring instinct. It's thrust you into a defensive mode of performance. Okay, but what do you do? Well, take a look at the first finding. 48% intentionally decrease their work effort. So there's a loss in productivity. But 50% admit it. Go down to the bottom. 25% admit to taking their frustration out on customers. It's incredible. And so really, we can see that the employee experience drives the customer experience. And we have hard empirical data now that shows us that this is the case. So can you see the train of consequences, unintended, very costly consequences that come from this? Pretty amazing. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Let's go into the 4 stages now. We said at the beginning that psychological safety means that it's not expensive to be yourself, but let's break that down. Let's excavate this concept a little bit more. There's a pattern to it. Psychological safety means that you can do 4 things. Number 1, feel included. That's number 1. That's the foundation. This is where we start. Number 2, feel safe to learn. 3, feel safe to contribute. And then 4, feel safe to challenge the status quo. And you can do these things without fear of being embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. That is evidence that there's psychological safety to do these things. Now let's show these 4 stages graphically, and I'll see if I can even get out my highlighter. So psychological safety overall is a function of respect, which you see on here on the vertical axis, and permission. So it's a function. It's a function of those 2 dimensions coming together to give us a certain level of psychological safety, which could be low or could be high. Now, here's how the progression works. We begin with inclusion safety. Why do we begin with inclusion safety? Because in our survey research, we ask people, what is the first thing that you're concerned with when you come into a social setting, social collective, team? It doesn't matter where it is. Could be at school, could be at work, could be at home, could be any social collective. And the vast majority of people said the first thing that we're concerned about is, am I included? Am I accepted? Do I feel a sense of belonging? That's why this comes first, because this is the first manifestation of natural human need. Then we progress from there, And we go to stage 2, which is learner safety. Learner safety means I can engage in the learning process and I'm not going to be embarrassed or marginalized. And even if you come in as an expert into a new social setting, you still have to learn the context and the culture, even if you're an expert. So there's always a level of learning. There's always a stage of learning, even if it's shorter because you're an expert. You still have to pass through the stage. Then you go to stage 3, which is contributor safety. This means that you feel free and able to contribute as a full member of the team to participate in that value creation process and to make a difference. And the reason this stage comes next is because after we acquire knowledge, skills, experience, the next natural human instinct is to use it. Let me use what I learned. Let me apply what I learned. That's contributor safety. Then we finally go to stage 4, the culminating stage. Challenger safety means that you can challenge the status quo, again, without jeopardizing your personal standing or reputation. Now, I want you to think about this. So the 4 stages follows 2 things. Number 1, the pattern of natural human need. Number 2, it follows a ladder of vulnerability. So you're climbing a ladder of vulnerability as you go from stage to stage to stage. So that by the time you get to challenger safety, your level of personal exposure and risk and vulnerability is at the highest point. Think about it. We're talking about challenging the status quo. It's one thing to be included, right? Stage 1. It's another to learn, stage 2. It's another to contribute, stage 3. But challenging the status quo, that's a different thing. So you can see that vulnerability has come to the highest level. Any questions or comments on that?
I have a question on your bottom, the permission. In
Yeah.
what context are you using permission?
Permission to participate as a member of the social collective, to participate in what the collective is all about, right? So why do we have this organization or team or whatever it is? Permission to contribute to the mission and the function of that organization.
So also there's some related research done by my colleagues who've been studying harassment, and they started studying disrespect. It was called the Tater scale because we first did it in Idaho, the employee attitude toward respect. And then they've called it the incivility scale. But I think what's underneath this is that we were measuring very deep psychological issues on a very, very good scales. So on the surface, yes, this is the behavior, but underneath that, it's really creating some psychological symptoms.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And to the point where people actually do get PTSD if it's,
Yeah.
and it only takes, and this is by coworkers, this isn't even by bosses, and it only takes a few. I mean, that's what's so interesting is that it's not like, oh, we can forget about the next day. We don't forget. We take it with us, and then it takes a long time to reestablish that safety. So it's just interesting to me how these 2 kinds of research come together.
That's a really good insight. So to your point, Jan, let me add a layer of complexity here that I think that you'll find interesting. If the respect is high, but the permission is low, we call this paternalism. So let's think about patterns of paternalistic behavior in organizations. If you, for example, you're working for a paternalistic boss, paternalism is like the helicopter parent that loves you, pats you on the head, but says, don't touch anything, right? So paternalism is typically well-meaning, it's well-intentioned, but we micromanage you because we don't understand the nature of leadership as a concept. So we don't empower, we disempower. That's paternalism. High respect, low permission, don't touch anything. The opposite, so this is a failure pattern. So think about the 4 stages as a bowling lane. We want to stay in the lane. If you go into the gutter in the upper left, that's paternalism. If you go into the gutter in the lower right, we call this exploitation. Now notice the combination, it's the opposite. Respect is low, permission is high. In other words, I want the value that you're able to create, but I don't value you. So what would be patterns of exploitation? There are common everyday patterns of exploitation in organizations, such as harassment, bullying, public shaming, manipulation, right? That's all exploitation. I want to extract the value from you, but I don't value you. I'm not showing you respect. And this goes to the very excellent point, Jan, that you made. At some point, this becomes clinical. It can have clinical effects, right? Deep-seated effects that create PTSD in the workplace. So what's so amazing is that we're starting to understand this so much better than we did in the past. Any questions or comments on paternalism or exploitation as failure patterns? Okay, so let's jump into stage one. Let's go a little deeper. And then, by the way, we're going to do some Q&A at the end, but by all means, please interrupt with questions or comments, because as we learn together and you have timely questions or comments, that's so valuable. So don't hesitate. So inclusion safety, as I said, it means that you feel included, accepted, and a sense of belonging. And it's stage one, it's the foundation. What's the social exchange when we have inclusion safety? The social exchange is that I bring my human status and my absence of harm in exchange for inclusion. If I can bring those two things, you are actually morally obligated to invite me into your society. There's no justification at that point for exclusion, right? What would be the basis or the rationale for exclusion? And so stage one is based on this principle that we call worth preceding worthiness. So I want you to think about this for a minute. Worth means that you have inherent or intrinsic worth as a human being. Therefore, I'm morally and ethically obligated to include you. Now, we can have our worthiness discussions later, and we will. And there's a time and a place for those, right? We're going to talk about performance from every angle. But when it comes to stage one inclusion safety, we're not talking about worthiness. We're talking about worth. And we include people on the basis of intrinsic worth. And then we talk about worthiness later. When we get these two principles mixed up, or we change the sequence, we have all kinds of problems in organizations. And that is why we have diversity, equity, and inclusion departments and efforts throughout organizations around the world. Because we get these two principles mixed up. We get them in the wrong order. When we get them in the right order, we can do some pretty incredible things. So let me ask you a question. How do you know you're included? What are the indicators? What do you think?
Your opinion is asked for and valued.
You're invited to the table.
You're invited. Yeah.
I think my
Listen to you.
physiology stays stable. I don't feel a racing heart rate. I notice body sensations that are
Okay.
calm.
Okay.
People listen when you talk.
They listen. Yep. Good. Any other indicators?
From the chat, we have you are acknowledged.
You're acknowledged.
I'm thinking about the word that pops into mind isn't a word, but micro inclusions, things like smiling, eye contact.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. Micro inclusions. Excellent. one of the findings from our research was this: people want to be accepted before they want to be heard. There's a sequence, right? And then that follows the stages, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me tell you, I'll give you a personal experience that I thought was quite interesting. I have a very old Chevy Suburban, and it's worth about $300, but I don't want to part with it because I still love it. I guess I'm emotionally attached to this old rust bucket. So I took it in to be serviced, and I could tell immediately that I was not being treated well. And it wasn't one instance. It soon became a pattern, right? And I'm in the pattern recognition business. This is what I do. So I could tell, okay, we have a pattern going here. And at first I didn't get it. And then it dawned on me, I was a little slow that day. It's the car. It's the car. The artifact of the car is an indication of your socioeconomic status. And they don't want you here to be seen with their clientele. They're going to hold their nose, but they want you to go, Tim, quickly. Okay. So that was what was happening, and it was very apparent. Then I went back not long after with my sedan, and I received a very different behavior. They were solicitous, they were kind, they were courteous, they were responsive. It was a very different experience. Again, why? The artifact of the car, right? That's just one example of getting worthiness mixed up with worth. If you get the sequence wrong, then we have all kinds of unintended negative consequences that we don't like. Humans do this all the time. Now, here's what's interesting about inclusion safety and the connection to the neuro research that is coming out. There's some excellent studies that have come out of UCLA, by the way, that show us this. Your brain processes social rejection in a similar way to physical pain. And so when you're rejected and you don't get stage 1 inclusion safety, it's kind of painful. It can be extremely painful. Now, sometimes we can brush it off and it's fine, but other times it really has a devastating effect. And I'm sure that all of you can relate to this because we all go through experiences of social rejection at one time or another. So here's a summary statement. Inclusion safety, stage 1, is a human right. It's not earned, it's owed. If you're human and harmless, then I'm morally obligated to include you. Including another human being should be an act of prejudgment. We do it as an act of prejudgment. Why? Based on worth, right? Not an act of judgment based on worthiness. So here comes Tim in his rust bucket Suburban. Let's see. Should we give him inclusion safety or not? Oh, you know what? I'm sorry, you didn't make the cut. It's not a nice enough car. Try again. So do you see how we got that mixed up? We do this all the time. So here's the pattern in the human species. We tend to govern ourselves based on junk theories of superiority. So apparently I wasn't worthy of good customer service on that day because of the car, which was an indication of my socioeconomic status. This happens to all of us. It happens all the time, millions of times. What are the factors that we use to invoke or make a claim for superiority? Let me show you a few. These are the factors that we use. And this is not even an exhaustive list. We can add to it, but these are some of the dominant factors that we use to claim superiority, to invoke superiority. So these are the junk theories that we use. So I'm better looking than you are. I'm smarter than you are. I come from a superior race or ethnicity. I have better educational credentials. I've got a better occupation, or I perform better than you, or whatever it is, right? I'm a millennial and you're a baby, but whatever it is, all of these junk theories of superiority are patently false. And yet we use them all the time. And this is what creates a lot of the division and the friction that we have. And so does this not come into play even in coaching engagements? Of course it does. Of course it does. What we're trying to do is create a culturally flat relationship, a culturally flat team or organization where we are agnostic to these factors. So as coaches, think about the way that you work as professional coaches with clients, with teams, with individuals. Is this not relevant, right? So how do we create stage one, just stage one inclusion safety? Let me offer a suggestion. Engage in behaviors that do three things. Number one, they ask, invite, and share. So any behavior that does one or a combination of these three things will almost invariably be inclusive. So think about that. And then how do you bring that in to foster and nurture a psychologically safe coaching environment? So let me just stop and I'll ask for what comments or questions do you have? So that's stage one, inclusion safety. Think about the things that you do initially when you begin a coaching engagement. You focus on the environment and on the relationship first, don't you? Don't you connect before you coach? Comments, questions?
I'll share something.
Yes, please.
I'm moving from being more of an educator to a coach. And so I find I really have to focus on the asking and inviting rather than jumping into sharing too soon. That can diminish safety quickly, I think. So spending more time on the situation and the current situation of the client is really valuable for me. And that's what I'm really focusing on.
Really good insight, Georgia. Thank you. What else?
Tim, we talk about creating an environment from the ICF competencies of trust and intimacy, and often that's created by making sure that we have the rapport built with the client, the asking, the invitation to learn about them, to know it's about them and not about us and our expertise or what we would do in a given situation, but what is it that they want to do or what they're seeking. And so our whole focus has to be on the person that we're working with, that individual. And making sure that they have an environment in that coaching relationship where they feel safe, that it's not expensive to be themselves, that they can share their perspectives and opinions and be accepted for where they are in the process.
Yeah. It's vital. Yeah, it's absolutely vital. And how do you state the ICF value there? How does it go?
Well, establishing trust and intimacy with the client is early in the competencies, and it's about establishing that foundation where they feel like you have their best interest at heart, so to speak. Yeah. It's about them, and they feel like they can trust you. Very, with a lot more than they might share with anybody else, including sometimes their spouse, perhaps.
That's very true. Very true. It's that trust and intimacy. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to stage two. Stage two is learner safety. just to go back, learner safety, or to review, learner safety means that I can engage in all aspects of the learning process, the discovery process. And I'm not going to get punished for it, embarrassed, marginalized. So what does that mean? Asking questions, giving and receiving feedback, experimenting, even making mistakes, right? So let's think about the social exchange for stage 2. It's a little different. Stage 1 was be human, be harmless in exchange for inclusion. Stage 2 is encouragement to learn in exchange for engagement to learn. The team, the leader, the social unit furnishes the encouragement, and the individual furnishes the engagement. That's the social exchange. Here's a question for you. This was something that we dug into in our interviews, in our qualitative research. Who goes first? Does one party or the other have an obligation to go first? So think about this, because this has direct relevance to coaching situations. Who goes first? It's not a, it's, I know you may be sticking your neck out there to answer. So I want you to think about this. So here, this may be illuminating. Did you ever have times in your life where you wanted to learn, but you didn't have the confidence? You didn't have the self-efficacy. You didn't feel that, right? But you still wanted to, or perhaps you didn't even know how to start because you didn't have the experience or the skill. Does that help? Because that happens to all of us at different points in life. And so what we found through the research is that the social unit or the leader has an obligation to be the first mover, right? Because the person, the individual, may not have the guidance, direction, encouragement, confidence, self-efficacy, and you have to hold his or her confidence until they can get their own. And so if you don't go first, then oftentimes they will fall between the cracks and there will be a casualty. One of the case studies, or one of the statistics rather, that I give in the book, if you haven't read it, is that a student drops out of high school in the United States every 26 seconds. Well, that's a tragedy. And the research shows that most of these students, barring a legitimate learning disability, they have the ability to do the academic work. Yeah, they may have fallen behind, but they can do the work. They can even catch up. What happened? Well, they didn't have the guidance, the encouragement, the love, the direction. They lost confidence and they called it quits. Is that pattern, is that any different for adults? No, it's not any different. It's perhaps more poignant when you're in your formative years. It's more of a defining experience, but it doesn't end. It doesn't end. Learner safety is vital for adults as it is for adolescents or children. And so we have to think about this. Are we providing that environment? Are we providing the encouragement? Okay, same question. How do you know it's safe to learn? What are you paying attention to?
What's coming up for me is how foundational that listening is to your stage 1. It seems to underlay all the conditions there. And so if that's the case, then the question of who goes first almost doesn't apply because it can be simultaneously. It just happens. If you've
Yeah.
been listened to,
Yeah.
then you're not afraid to dare to learn.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, Linda, because it's coming from stage one. You already have it.
Mhm.
It's a good point. But isn't it interesting that listening is a profound form of encouragement,
Mhm. Absolutely.
right? Great point. Other comments?
Kind
I
of go
give you, yeah,
back
go
to
ahead.
what the reaction is to what other people, like if you're in a group environment, if it's someone that's not feeling that, is what is the reaction that people that are taking a chance, what kind of reaction are they getting?
Yeah.
So if it's more in a group environment, or even if you look at it in terms of going back, I think it was Linda said something about kind of those micro kind of things of seeing somebody giving you those just visual cues also of
Yes.
they're accepting, they're encouraging, so you're feeling like you're getting that acceptance and you're seeing it somewhere.
Yeah.
And yeah, and like it's somebody just put in here, ability to make mistakes without punishment. So Nancy just put that in there, and that's kind of thinking that too.
Yeah.
It's like if you make a mistake, if you see how people that make mistakes, how they're being treated,
That's right.
compared to yeah, on that part.
That's
It's just
excellent.
it's I think that together feel wrong.
Mhm. One of the case studies that I give in the book that it's had a profound impact on me personally is I studied a high school calculus teacher. He could be the best in the world. His enrollment numbers and his pass rate numbers for the AP calculus tester, it's off the charts. It's 4 times the national average. What he does, I did observations in his classroom. I interviewed students. I interviewed him. What he does is he goes in and he shifts the prevailing norms of the classroom. And it takes about 3 weeks every time a new semester starts. And what he does is he detaches fear from mistakes and failure. He takes them apart. He detaches them. He disconnects them so they don't go together anymore. And they don't go together in the minds and the hearts of the students. Now, at first, it's disorienting to the students. They don't get it. It's not normal. But with reinforcement, it'll take about 3 weeks before those new norms settle down. They settle in and they become the new DNA of the classroom culture. What he reinforces every day is mistakes are not the exception. They are the expectation. This is how we learn. We go from mistake to mistake to mistake. What happens is once he transforms the culture, you'll see the behavior shift in the students where they lean into the work and they lose the normal fear and inhibition that are associated with learning risk. Does that make sense? So they don't even care anymore. They don't care if they're wrong. They'll lean in and they'll go for it. They become aggressive, self-directed learners. It's incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Now, I've had some amazing teachers myself, and I'm sure you have, but I've never seen anyone take it to this extent. It's absolutely incredible. That's what we're talking about. True learner safety, because we all bring inhibition and some anxiety and some fear to the learning process, right? It's absolutely incredible. Let me give you an example of what happens. So here's a quote. This is Albert Camus. He won the Nobel Prize in literature back in 1918. And when he did, he wrote this very affectionate note to his grade school teacher. The very next week, he said, without you, without the affectionate hand you extended to the small, poor child that I was. Without your teaching and example, none of all this would have happened. Now, I'm sure you can relate to this, right? We've all had people that have affected us this way. They gave us learner safety. They allowed us to blossom and grow and accelerate in our growth and development. That's what we're talking about. It doesn't end in childhood or adolescence. So here's what we know about the learning process. It's intellectual and emotional. Those two tracks are interwoven in the learning process. It's the thinking brain and the feeling brain coming together. So the reason, going back to the reason that those high school students quit is because they were emotionally bruised learners. Once you become emotionally bruised, you are cognitively impaired as a learner. You're not going to learn as well. You're not going to learn as effectively because you're emotionally bruised. You cannot detach emotions from the learning process. That's not how humans are. That's not how we work. That's not how we function. And so hopefully you'll see some relevance in the coaching process, in coaching engagements. Do emotions play into that process? What's your experience?
Emotions are a very integral part of every aspect of our behavior. Before we even have a conscious thought, it's preceded usually by a feeling, by a intuitive, less than a second before our mind even recognizes what's happening. We're either creating, like Leon Festinger called, between competitive cognitive elements. You either have dissonance, resonance, or irrelevance.
Yeah.
So in the aspect of the dissonance, now we're going to activate the negative emotional aspects, which will inhibit learning, as opposed to using positive emotions like hope and compassion, which will in fact help you learn better, help you be more creative, and help you be more resonant as a person.
Very well said, Kent. Very well said. So how do you do this? Number one, you have to model learner safety, and you have to model the vulnerability that is part of that. And then you encourage learning in others, and then you protect them in that process. Okay, let's keep going because we got two more. So contributor safety, stage 3. The social exchange is autonomy with guidance in exchange for results. Now, this becomes much more performance-based when you get to stage 3. The individual typically wants a degree of autonomy and needs guidance, right? You can't have no guidance. But the organization needs, the leader needs results. You have to deliver. So it's very much a performance-based social exchange. So here's a way to summarize this. Human beings have an innate need to use their knowledge, skills, and experience to contribute and make a difference. When they can, right, when it's safe to do this and they can contribute in a meaningful way, they develop self-efficacy, self-worth, and the capacity of independent high performance. And this is what we want. This is what we want in children, in students, in athletes, in performers, in employees, in leaders. This is what we want. And so they need some degree, again, of autonomy and guidance, and we need results. So here's kind of the pattern that we see in those that are able to nurture contributor safety. They explain the why, number one, because the why taps motivation. The why always taps motivation. If you don't have a deep why, you're not going to stay with it. You're going to fall off the wagon. Number two, assign the what. You do this, you do this, you do this, I'll do that. So we break up our work, we make assignments. And then to the extent possible, we delegate the how. That's where the ownership comes in. That's where the creativity comes in. That's where we can figure out how, if there's a big figure it out factor, it's extremely engaging. This is where people have peak engagement experiences, when they get to do a lot of the how. So that's the pattern for contributor safety. So let me go straight to stage 4, because I want to spend a minute on this. Challenger safety means, again, that you feel free and able to challenge the status quo. And you won't jeopardize your standing or personal reputation. No retribution, no retaliation. The social exchange is fascinating. Air cover in exchange for candor. If you want candor, then I need protection for that candor. And if I don't get protection, if I'm not offered protection, if I don't see evidence of protection, you're not going to get the candor. And it would be disingenuous of you to even ask for candor, right? That's not good faith. If you want candor, I need air cover for that candor. That's the social exchange. Okay, let's go to, how do you do this? So this is stage 4, represented graphically in the best way that I know how to do this based on the research. The coach's job and the leader's job is to do 2 things simultaneously, and this is not easy. Number 1, increase intellectual friction. It's through intellectual friction that we solve problems, create solutions, make breakthroughs, and we innovate. The raw material of innovation is creative abrasion. It's constructive dissent. It's hard-hitting dialogue and debate. So we need high intellectual friction, but we need to keep the social friction down. Why? Because social friction gets in the way. If the social friction comes up as the intellectual friction comes up at some point, the social friction will shut down the intellectual friction, and you will come to impasse. You will collapse because there's no lubricating oil for that collaboration. And that lubricating oil is psychological safety at the highest level. This is a hard job for leaders and coaches to do, but this is the job. This is the job to be done. Increase the intellectual friction, decrease the social friction. So let me give you a parting thought, and then we can do a little Q&A. As coaches, as individuals, wherever you are a cultural architect, whether you like it or not. We all are. Here's how it works. A pattern of thought or behavior in a person is a habit. A pattern of thought or behavior on a team is a norm. And a collection of norms in an organization becomes a culture. What's so interesting about culture is that we are all contributing to culture every day. We all radiate influence, and there's no off switch. You can't turn that radiation off. You can't wake up tomorrow and say, you know, I don't want to do that tomorrow. I'll do it today, and then I'm going to take a day off, and then I'll come back and do it the next day. It doesn't work that way. You are a cultural architect. You are curating the culture every day. The only question is, what influence are you radiating? What norms are you modeling? That's the only question. It's the only question. So with that, let's go to our Q&A. And I'll just mention too that I have, in case you're interested, I have a behavioral guide that's a companion. It's a how-to companion to the book that you can download. It's free. That might be helpful to you. It gets very concrete in identifying behaviors that are important in each of the 4 stages. So I'll just mention that to you. If you're interested, you can download it, and it might be a good resource for you. So with that, why don't we go to a little Q&A? And we can talk about anything that we've talked about so far or anything different that you'd like to talk about for a few minutes. And Stacy and Vicki, how much time do we have for Q&A? I think we got like 10 or 15 or something.
I'd like to be finished at 12:55.
Okay, so we got 15 minutes. Great. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to go back to show the 4 stages just as a backdrop, and that might help us. And then whatever questions or comments, let's do that.